We are looking in these presentations at the way in which people's religious and spiritual perspectives shape the way they think about end-of-life care. In the previous presentation, I explained the distinction between religion and spirituality, and we considered the broad ways in which those perspectives are relevant to healthcare. Our focus, of course, is going to be on the moral values which arise out of people's religious and spiritual perspectives, and particularly then how that affects the way decisions are made about end-of-life care. In this presentation, I want to summarize what can be said about each of the world's great religious traditions with respect to their basic thought patterns in relation to end-of-life care. I want to begin with a quotation from an article called Euthanasia, the Hindu Perspective, by Namita Nimbalkar. You're not required to read this essay, but it is a very useful filling out of the summary material you'll find in the essays you are assigned. And the essay by Nimbalkar is available to you under Files on the Canvas website. Nimbalkar writes, "Historically, religious communities have sought to appropriate death within the life cycle through rituals of remembrance. And religious teachings have emphasized that death brings meaning to mortality. The process of dying is often portrayed as an invitation to spiritual insight and a key moment in the cultivation of spiritual identity. The world's great traditions of moral wisdom all begin with a strong predisposition to favor the preservation of life, although the specific reasons for this conviction vary from tradition to tradition." Let me start with Christian perspectives, though much of what I say here would also apply to Jewish and Islamic ones, as these are all religions that share these beliefs. A belief in a single creator God, that life is a gift from God, that all have a moral responsibility to preserve life, that death is a part of life, but it does not represent life's end because there is life after death, and we will face some kind of judgment, or some kind of an appraisal of our lives that determine our fate after our deaths. In general, Christian traditions are clear in their rejection of euthanasia, or what we have called active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. The reason for that is nicely summarized in a statement from a leader in the Assemblies of God, a Protestant Pentecostal denomination. He says, "We simply feel that it's not our prerogative to end life. God is the giver of life, not us." I want to suggest another basic reason for the rejection of active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in Christian traditions. A desire for these is typically generated by an experience of suffering. Suffering is, of course, a part of human existence, and all religious traditions attempt in one way or another to make sense of suffering. Christianity believes that Jesus suffered with and for us on the cross, and that we are called to share his cross and suffering. Now, of course, the cross of Jesus, according to Christian belief, led to his resurrection and the gift of eternal life. Put differently, the meaning of his suffering was found only in the resurrection. But the important thing is that suffering, in this perspective, is given meaning and purpose. For that reason, it's not seen as something entirely evil or as something to be avoided at all costs. It is potentially a means to resurrection, redemption, and salvation. Think of Nimbalkar's claim that death and the suffering that accompany it are often profound shapers of our spiritual identity. Despite this broadly shared rejection of active euthanasia, Christian perspectives are typically accepting of or open to what we have called passive euthanasia. That is, the withholding, withdrawing, or refusing of life-sustaining treatment under certain circumstances. As the Buell essay notes, quote, "The Catholic Church allows withholding and withdrawing of futile therapy if it is burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, or disproportionate to the expected outcome." And the essay notes that, quote, "Most Protestants are comfortable with the present wide array of life-sustaining therapies, but if there is little hope of recovery, most will understand and accept the withholding or withdrawal of therapy," unquote. The key moral issue from most Christian perspectives is the matter of intent, which we have seen elevated and illuminated in the essay by Sullivan related to active euthanasia. We should never have death as our intention in any action, even the withdrawal of a life-sustaining treatment. But where our intention is only to spare ourselves or another unnecessary suffering, withdrawal is permissible. This matter of intention leads to what might be a surprising conclusion in Roman Catholic thought. It is perfectly permissible, according to Roman Catholic teaching, to hasten death as a result of our attempts to relieve suffering by giving another dose of morphine, for example, so long as that death is foreseen but not intended. This has to do with what is called the principle of double effect. The effect of the morphine may be both to relieve suffering and to hasten death. It's okay to give that morphine so long as we only intend the relief of suffering, but not the hastening of death. The Greek Orthodox Church seems to have a bit more cautious view, even with respect to passive euthanasia. According to the Buell essay, from the Greek Orthodox perspective, quote, "Every death resulting from human decisions," unquote, "is an insult to God." The Church, quote, "condemns as unethical every medical act that does not contribute to the prolongation of life," unquote. It would be interesting to know if those very absolute statements are actually adhered to by most people who follow the Greek Orthodox tradition. Let me say a bit about the Jewish tradition. The Jewish legal system, called halakha, is derived from the Jewish Bible and a long history of commentary by learned rabbis on the Bible and human experience. That's called the Talmud. This traditional Jewish moral perspective seems significantly more cautious than what I've described as the typical Protestant and Catholic perspectives. As Buell and other sources indicate, there's a tendency to draw a distinction between withholding and withdrawing life-sustaining treatments. Recall that I have said that in the contemporary biomedical ethics community in the United States, either are thought to be acceptable when the treatment is more burdensome than beneficial. But traditional Jewish perspectives seem to disagree somewhat. From that perspective, what matters is whether the treatment is continuous or intermittent. One may not stop a life-sustaining treatment that is continuous, according to this Jewish tradition, but because one may decide not to start a life-sustaining treatment, where the treatment is intermittent, it may be withheld. So, simply put, one may not withdraw a respirator, assuming the patient's need for it is continuous, but one may decide not for a do not resuscitate order, since CPR is something one only needs intermittently. I ask you to pay particular attention to the stories in the essay by Cohen, When the Doctor is Not God. The second story there deals with a situation in which this Jewish perspective was quite relevant to how a patient and her family thought about her end-of-life care. From a Muslim perspective, according to Buell's essay, while, quote, "everything possible must be done to prevent premature death," unquote, life-sustaining treatments can be withheld or withdrawn in terminally ill Muslim patients when the physicians are certain about the inevitability of death and that treatment in no way will improve the condition or quality of life. The intention must never be to hasten death, only to abstain from overzealous treatment, unquote. Notice again, the reference here to intentions and their moral significance. Bülow says that in the Islamic perspective, the decision to withdraw extraordinary treatment, quote, is seen as allowing death to take its natural course, unquote. This reflects a basic characteristic of all the Abrahamic traditions, a recognition that death is a natural part of life. And so when death occurs naturally, and when we are unable to prolong that dying or restore quality of life or heal, it's perfectly appropriate to allow that natural course to continue. Notice also the idea that according to Islam, the decision to forego life-sustaining treatment, quote, should be a collective decision taken on the basis of informed consent, following a consultation with the patient's family and involving all those involved in providing health care, including the attending physician. 3, for the case of withdrawing life support for brain death, for example. This also applies to patients in a persistent vegetative state, unquote. This suggests to me much less focus on individual autonomy, as is characteristic of modern secular biomedical ethics, and as has been reflected in this course, with its emphasis on patient autonomy. From the Muslim perspective, there seems to be a much greater concern about the including of the family and of the physicians in a corporate decision-making process. You should notice also that Islam accepts the idea of double effect as it relates to pain relief that hastens death, and it shares the Christian and Jewish rejection of active euthanasia. The Quran, Muslim scriptures, say, quote, that it is the sole prerogative of Allah to bestow life and to cause death, unquote. And therefore, euthanasia is never allowed. Well, this gives you some introduction to the basic perspectives of what are called the Abrahamic religions, those 3 great world traditions that all share a sense of being rooted in the faith experience of the patriarch Abraham. I'm talking about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Next time, we'll look at the Eastern religious traditions of Buddhism and